Hi everyone, it's Professor Hall. We are continuing our discussion on Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. We're looking in particular at the historical, cultural context of the book, so that when you read it, you're like, what exactly is this song about? And what is he trying to parody in this poem? We have a lot of history, a lot of background, and I just want to pick up on where we left off last time. We looked at the first 6 chapters. So video 1 has some background, some information about the author, and then a breakdown of chapters 1, 2, through 3. 1, 2, 3. The second video had chapters 4 through 6, and we talked about 2 things that I feel like I didn't do a great job fully connecting for you, so I want to do that in the beginning of this video, and then we're going to look at chapters 7, 8, and 9. So one of the things that we talked about last time is that this book really is satirizing Victorian society. And we talked about some of the ways in which Carroll did that, particularly with the Duchess in the Pig and Pepper chapter in chapter 6, and a little bit in chapter 4 with the rabbit, the white rabbit, satirizing the landed gentry, right? And the way in which they were afraid of their superiors and then mistreating their inferiors. We also talked about the ways in which this is an episodic novel, so that really each chapter is kind of its own little mini adventure. The through narrative is just that Alice is in Wonderland going through all of these little episodes, right? Each chapter has some kind of a tag or a transition that pulls us into the next, but there's not really an overarching longer narrative, although I do think we have some little indications that Alice is changing and that she's a slightly dynamic character, and we'll get into those in this video and the next. But I wanted to kind of bring those 2 concepts together, the concept of having the episodes and also the concept of satirizing things, to really explain that each chapter, in my opinion, is kind of meant to satirize a different aspect of Victorian life, society, culture. So chapter 1, Down the Rabbit Hole, this is sort of satirizing some expectations for children, that Alice is bored, which children were not supposed to be. She's too lazy to even make a daisy chain. Her sister is trying to be a good girl reading a book with no pictures, and obviously her sister is a little bit older as well. But we have this idea of curiosity and the era's fascination with an exploration of the unknown. So curiosity was really a high emphasis was placed on that in Victorian society, and yet Alice's boredom leads to this curiosity, and then her curiosity kind of gets her in trouble. Not as much of a satire as some of the other ones that are a little more heavy-handed. Chapter 2, The Pool of Tears, is supposed to sort of show the absurdity of emotional excess, those romantic tales that came before, where we have, people crying and ripping out their hair, and we're running around on the moors and all of that kind of thing. We've got here really trying to highlight that excessive expression and crying a literal flood of tears, how silly that is, and emotionality. We see that again with the Mock Turtles story, where we're kind of making fun of that sentimentality a little bit. Chapter 3 is a little bit more obvious in the satire. Direct satire of political process, the caucuses in the United States we talked about, as well as the type of caucus that existed in British society, which were these committees that kind of ran around and never really did anything, right? The self-serving nature of these political systems. In chapter 5, we have satire of education and authority figures, as we have this caterpillar trying to get Alice to recite things, and it kind of mirrors how Victorian educators would sometimes use riddles and just sort of expect students to decipher the meaning. At least That's sort of what's going on there. Chapter 6, as we talked about, mocking and satirizing domestic life and child rearing, but really trying to show the problems in which a person has these high ideals, which we're going to meet the Duchess again in a totally different personality this time, because she's a hypocrite. And some people have these ideas about childhood that they're espousing outside the walls of the home, and then in the home, they're not treating the children very well, right? So if you remember, satire is this literary form where we're using humor, irony, exaggeration to kind of ridicule and criticize individuals or institutions or societal norms. So really, one of the things that I want to stress here is that many people will say, and I think probably I said this myself in a couple lectures, that Victorian, the golden age of children's literature, which is taking place in the Victorian times in Britain and in the post-Civil War times in the United States. Also Canada is involved there too. We're going to get into Canadian book later. But at any rate, this time period, yes, authors are trying to get away from didactic moral teaching in a way. That does not mean that they're not trying to teach their readers something. And I think that people believe that just because a book is filled with whimsy that it's not trying to teach. I think that it is trying to teach. It's just teaching using humor and satire and exaggeration and parody and irony and all of these things, right? We're still learning something. And it's just like, what does the book want to teach? Why is this important? To me, this is important because this comes to the crux of debates about children's literature even today, right? There are book bans on both sides of our political spectrum in the United States, where one side is saying, like, you're trying to teach kids the wrong things by having this kind of story. And the other side is saying, you're trying to teach kids the wrong things by having this kind of story. And the fighting back and forth and some of the things that are going on in school boards and things like that, I think a lot of that comes down to our understanding of what's appropriate for children. How do we teach them? How do we entertain them? And what should they be reading? Right? And what is the function of a book? Is the function of a book just to entertain? Is the function of a book to teach a moral lesson? What type of moral lessons then should they be learning, or do we want them to learn, and what do we value? Those are still questions that we are asking today, and they were certainly questions that were going on in Carroll's time. And he is very concerned with things of that nature. So we have, even he himself is a mathematics teacher who was using things like riddles and word games and word puzzles. He had self-written pamphlets, like over 200 of them, which we'll talk about more in a minute, that included like games he had made up and riddles for his students and little mathematical puzzles for them to solve. And yet he's making fun of this in chapter 5 with the caterpillar, who is also speaking in riddles and expecting Alice to kind of take the role of a student and figure it out. He doesn't even tell her what side of the mushroom will make her bigger and smaller. She's got to figure it out on her own, right? So, I didn't mean to get so excited, but that's what's going on in this book, and I do find it exciting. So let's pick up with chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a mad tea party. So Alice encounters the Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and a Dormouse at this nonsensical, whimsical tea party. So what is the satire here? Well, we're making fun of social etiquette, right? To the Britons, tea is very important. In the United States, we don't have such a real emphasis on tea as much. And even when you do go to a tea party, you could maybe take etiquette classes where you're or you could be invited to a formal tea. I have been to formal teas before, but this is in Victorian times, rigid, and to Carol, a little pointless customs. So That's what is going on here. And the conversation is, again, filled with riddles, absurd logic, and the very famous "why is a raven like a writing desk?" which I have a couple answers for that I hope you'll enjoy. So a little bit of in jokes here. The Mad as a Hatter, a lot of people do know that hatters at this point in time, and in fact until recently, would kind of go mad. The mercury used in cutting felt, now there are laws against that, but at that time there were not. But it was a common cause of mercury poisoning. So victims developed a tremor that was known as Hatter's shakes. It affected their eyes, their gait, their walking, their limbs. It would mess up their speech many times. In advanced stages, they would develop hallucinations and even psychosis. So it was very it was quite a dangerous profession. And actually, I come from my mom's hometown, which is about 10 minutes outside of my hometown. She moved pretty far away. My mother's hometown has a felt factory there, and this was when her mother was young, not uncommon for people to have these problems. And by the time my mother was younger, they had put in some safety guidelines, but still people were having some effects from the felt company and from being in that factory. So then we have the March hare. So to explain the March hare, people had this idea in Victorian times that rabbits would kind of get like a spring fever of sorts, and a hare, particularly male hares, would go into a frenzy in March. So the folk belief was that this was their running season. In fact, hares have an 8-month breeding season. That is why we have the phrase, going at it like rabbits. Like, this is why. So males chase the females, and then they would get into like little boxing matches over them. But that's where the term March hare comes from. And then we have the dormouse. Now, the dormouse is like a little tree living rodent. It's more like a small squirrel than a mouse. The name comes from the Latin dormire, which means to sleep, and it's not D-O-O-R. It's not a dormouse that lives in a door, although I think there would be some fun wordplay there if Lewis Carroll were here. But dormire is the Latin. I'm butchering my Latin, sorry, for my Latin teacher who might be hearing this, but the animal had a hibernation all winter, so that's why the name comes from the Latin to sleep. And also it's nocturnal, so it really is sleepy during the day. Now, interestingly enough, many people don't know, but Victorian children would keep these as pets. So you can kind of think of like how we keep hamsters today, right? So many of them would have dormice, and because it's a nocturnal animal, they would fill like an old teapot with some grass or hay and kind of keep it in there in a little habitat, but then it would be very sleepy whenever they try to pull it out to play with it. So I think that having that knowledge enhances our understanding of just how delightful this dormouse would be, and also why it just loves treacle, which is basically molasses. It loves sugar is another way of putting it. That the drawings in this chapter, if you have that version with the Tenniel drawings, the drawing of the Hatter, many people think is a burlesque or like a caricature of the prime minister at the time. So that's sort of interesting as well. So basically we have Alice in this scene where, if you go to tea, there are a lot of etiquette rules that you need to follow, but then these creatures are, again, following a completely different arbitrary set of rules, right? And they're insisting that the rules are important, but at the same time, she doesn't know them. And I do think, again, that this is a real instance of just how confusing it is to be a kid in an adult's world, that you are trying to navigate things and you don't understand the rules, and there's all this etiquette you're supposed to follow, but you might not always get it. The Mad Hatter's riddle, why is a raven like a writing desk, was Carol said in a letter, because both produce a few notes, though they are very flat, meaning that you would write notes to people on your writing desk and that a raven might caw a few times. But a raven is not a songbird, and the notes that you're writing on your writing desk are probably very flat and boring. He also said, but this is an afterthought. The riddle, when invented, had no real answer at all. Other people said because Poe wrote on both, meaning he wrote on the writing desk and he wrote about the raven, which would have been published before this book. I like that answer. And I also like both have quills dipped in ink, because at the time, yes, you'd have a quill pen dipped in ink, and a raven has black feathers that look like they've been dipped in ink. So those are some fun answers to our unanswerable riddle. So there's this debate about time, and there's this implication. I have another video for you guys, not from me, about the math in this book, and this sort of comes into play in this chapter a little bit. The watch is 2 days off, so the tea party never ends. We have a lot of playing with time in this chapter, and this idea that we had also at the White Rabbit's house, that if Alice was not to grow up any further, that she would be kind of stuck in childhood. Now we see people who are actually stuck in time, and we have, this mouse who's very sleepy all the time. We have a hatter who has gone mad, and we have a hare who apparently is in a frenzy because it's his season. So perhaps that is one of the reasons that all of these characters are kind of stuck where they are. Because it's always tea time, they have to keep, rotating around the table and switching spots. But the tea party never really fully ends. So it's suggesting to Alice that time can be subjective. Now, what you have to really understand here is that in Victorian times, in the Victorian period, time became quite important. We have an increase of industrialization, and that means that our concept of time changes. This story is supposed to be underground for all intents and purposes, so we don't have the sun and the moon to kind of keep track of time in that way. But we do have our people who are now, instead of in an agrarian society where we get up when the sun comes up, we go to bed when the sun sets, or at least we settle for the day when the sun sets. We're throwing off our circadian rhythms, and we are getting up by the clock. We are doing work by the clock. We are trying to be in a factory, getting things produced by the clock. How many things can we get produced in such and such a time? The idea of time in that way, it really was a revolutionary change that took place. So much so that a lot of stories become really at this point in this period really become obsessed with this idea of time. What does time mean? Is it arbitrary? All of that kind of thing is going on in the background. I really can't express. This is like the difference between phones that are on a line and having a cell phone. It's that big of a change for these people. It really changed their society completely during the Industrial Revolution. And then they're kind of dealing with those effects even in this book. So Carol was also, again, with the wordplay and the games, he's the one who said that a stopped clock is more accurate than a clock that loses a minute a day. The first clock is right exactly twice every 24 hours, because if you stop it at like 12:05, it'll be 12:05 twice a day, right? The other clock is right only once in 2 years. You may ask, Carol says, how am I to know when 8 o'clock does come? My clock will not let me. Be patient. You will know that when 8 o'clock comes, your clock is right. Very good. Then your rule is this. Keep your eyes fixed on the clock, and at the very moment it is right, it will be 8 o'clock. Okay. I can't follow completely that logic, because he's trying to show that logic has its limits, right? And so does our concept of time. And the idea also that A minute might seem very long to one person, and to another it might seem not long at all. This lecture has gone on for about 10 minutes longer than I intended total, and we're not even through the chapters yet. To some of you, that's delightful and you just want more, and to others, you're like, I can't take it. Hurry it up. Stop talking about clocks. So we will. The Mad Hatter's song in this chapter parodies Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So we have Twinkle Twinkle Little Bat. I think this is one of the few poems that children do still know because of the song. The Dormouse tells a tale, Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly. These are references to Alice and her two sisters. So Lacey is an anagram for Alice. Tilly is Edith, her older sister. It was her nickname. Matilda, and then Elsie, or her younger sister, sorry. Her younger sister's nickname. And then Elsie is a play, again. Lorena Charlotte, Elsie. So we have a little bit of the family snuck in there for the sake of the story. As I said, treacle is British for molasses. There are treacle tarts as well as Bakewell tarts. And we have a lot of talk of tarts later, right? And the mouse is obsessed with treacle. So it is molasses. It's also used in medicinal compounds at that point for like snake bites and poisons. So the Dormouse talks here of a treacle well. A treacle well is, I thought maybe it was like a treacle tart, but upon further research, a treacle well was believed to be like water of medicinal value, like the treacle compounds that they would use for snake bites and poison. So there were treacle wells, or things that were called treacle wells. Basically, the idea is like it's a sweet water that has some medicinal value in that well. If you have been to like someplace like Saratoga or a spring like that, those are the kind of wells that we're talking about. But people think they have some medicinal components, and then probably did have like minerals in them that might have helped in that time period when not everybody was getting the vitamins and nutrients they needed. So we are pulled then into chapter 8. Chapter 8 is the Queen's Croquet Ground. Again, now we went from tea time with its rules and etiquette. Now we're in a game that has other rules and etiquette, right? So again, we are satirizing some of the Victorian ideas of what games should be, with a lot of rules and a lot of, it's like going to play golf and you wear shorts that are the wrong length, and then you're not doing the right etiquette, or you should be letting someone play through or not. A lot of golf is just learning those kind of things, right? We're also having a lot of critique about authoritarian rule and the absurdity of unchecked power and fear-based governance. Now, this is a lot after the French Revolution, but I do think that we see some of that in here. Although, in comparison, this queen and the king, who sort of is our judge later on, they have fear-based government, but nobody ever is really completely punished. But then Alice is also not completely sure about that. So Alice arrives at the Queen's court, the Queen of Hearts, not the Red Queen, by the way. No, the Red Queen is in the next book, in the sequel. The Queen is quick-tempered and shouting off with their heads. They're playing with flamingos as mallets and hedgehogs as balls. The original version actually had them playing with ostriches instead of flamingos, but I think working with Tenniel, he saw that flamingos would look a little sillier, so we switched it from ostriches to flamingos. So Alice, really, her goal, this whole book, this should really be sort of a climax for her in terms of the MacGuffin, that thing that she's chasing, has been to get into the garden. So she's been growing and shrinking, has this little golden key, is trying to get into this garden so badly. So it's really a symbol of her realization of her dreams. And now she enters the garden, and is it paradise? No. No, it's not. The beautiful red flowers have been painted. And instead of, the fairy tale queen and king that are in most stories, we have impotent rulers who are quite dumb, and every little thing that bothers them, they're screaming off with their head, right? So what are some of the things that we see here? Well, the playing cards are really meant to be like a satirization of the very rigid British class system and possibly bureaucracy. I mean, it can be applied to any government, but in particular Britain. Here, the spades, a little bit of wordplay and stuff again, playing with these ideas. Spades are gardeners who would use a spade and a hoe and a rake. The clubs are soldiers, so that idea of, having a club. The diamonds are courtiers, and the hearts are the 10 royal children. So, the queen is threatening violence, and there seems to be a little bit of comedy here, but also a serious sort of threat. Carol said that the Queen of Hearts was, quote, an embodiment of ungovernable passion, a blind and aimless fury. And that is how he thought of her in his mind, that she's just, ungovernable passions, meaning you're upset about this, and then you call for somebody's head, and then you're upset about that, and you call for somebody's head. And unfortunately, that kind of passion and lack of emotional control combined with power can be very, very dangerous. As I said, Carol spent a lot of time inventing games. So we do have this awkward and unruly game going on with it's similar to real croquet, but it should be a fun, lighthearted activity, and then it's kind of a cruel spectacle, right? But he published about 200 pamphlets privately, and out of those 200, about 10% of them, 20 or so, had to do with these games that he came up with. Castle croquet was a very complicated game that he played with the little sisters, so Alice and her sisters in real life. He also had other pamphlets on math puzzles, logic games, wordplay, all of that kind of thing. But I think it's interesting that, we have Castle Croquet as a game, and some of the ideas from that game, again, make it into the book. Alice is still very polite at this point. Now, at different times, her anger has kind of burst through, but she is trying to be polite and kind to the queen, and to a certain extent to the Duchess. Is that out of fear? Is that out of her training as a Victorian child? We don't completely know. The queen doesn't really care. She just kind of has bloodlust that she wants to satisfy. So we have the satirization of the games, and then we come into chapter 9. And here we are satirizing the impractical nature of Victorian education. We have a little bit of satire making fun of, it seems, possibly alumnus or alumni of particular schools in Britain that had that were known for sentimentality and looking on their college years with over fondness, which is interesting to me because a lot of this book is looking at childhood with an over fondness and a nostalgic longing, but whatever. So the mock turtle, again, this is something that is left out of a lot of the adaptations. I think that's because he is so melancholy. He's talking about his strange schooling experiences. He has a lot of wordplay in there, so reeling and writhing instead of reading and writing. The griffin joins in and just sort of adds to the absurdity. So again, the Duchess, really kind and polite as long as she thinks Alice is listening to her, and nasty as soon as she thinks Alice isn't. This is a carryover from chapter 6, which I think is really interesting because if we didn't know, it really does seem almost like a totally different character. And Alice, for her part, now is really starting to become more and more annoyed with these characters and is beginning to call them out on their hypocrisy. So she's moralizing to this child, but she's doing so in a very hypocritical way. And Alice thinks, I don't want to have pepper in my soup like this woman because it gives people a peppery temper. And then chamomile, which we know as a tea but was also used in medicine, makes them bitter. And then barley sugar is for children, and that was like the stick candy that we still can find today. And barley sugar makes children sweet, and that must be why they're sweet. So a little fun here with the food. The Duchess says, take care of the scents and the sounds will take care of themselves. This is a play on take care of the pence and the pounds will take care of themselves. Or here we would say, much less elegantly, take care of the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. There's further wordplay between Alice and the Duchess, and they kind of play this parlor game of animal, vegetable, mineral, which is like our 20 questions. If you've ever played that, you have something in your mind, and then the person has 20 questions to guess what it is using just yes or no answers, right? The Griffin is interesting to me because he's one character that seems to see past the surface. Everyone else would maybe think that the mock turtle is, oh, and sighing and sad, and the Griffin is like, no. No. Mock turtle soup is an imitation of green turtle soup. So as turtles became less prevalent, people would have this mock turtle soup so it would taste like soup, right? It's pretend turtle. It usually was made from veal, which is sort of why we think that the illustration of the mock turtle has the head and the hind hoofs and the tail of a calf. The griffin was an emblem for Oxford's Trinity College. He's meant to be awake and on guard, so having him be sleeping could be sort of a satire in that. And they're both meant to be sort of sentimental college alumni who are looking back on those years and getting too sentimental about them. So reading and writing become reeling and writhing. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division become ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. The uglification is probably my favorite. We see that again in Pippi Longstocking with plutification. Painting with oils is fainting in coils. And then the drawling master who taught drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils. So this is actually a reference to art critic and troubled figure in history, John Ruskin. Ruskin is a friend of Carol's from the Pre-Raphaelite Society. So the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is a really important group in this time period. And Carol himself was a member. I think I might have talked about this before, but they are in favor of truth and nature, medieval inspired aesthetics. So before Raphael, especially because we have also photography coming in as an art form. So there are a lot of debates about what art means now that we can take pictures, right? And what that should look like. So you might have heard of Dante Gabriele Rossetti, his sister Christina Rossetti, who wrote The Goblin Market, another great work of Victorian literature, John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt. Ruskin is probably better well known now for having married and a literal child. And again, would this have been that unusual? No, but she quickly divorced him and married Millais. And then he proposed to a number of young girls, 10, 11, 12. One he waited for several years. He proposed to one young girl when he was in his 70s, and she was like not even 15. So quite a troubled history. And whether there was actual, I want to put this in a way that won't get me censored on YouTube. So whether there was actual impropriety there, we don't know. But we do know that he did try to chase after young girls. The girl he married, it seemed that they did not consummate their relationship, which was why she was able to get an annulment. So, and I said divorce, but I believe that it was annulled. At any rate, he was the drawing master for the little home. So he would come in and teach drawing, sketching, and painting in oils to the children. Again, wealthier families had this, right? They had tutors for various things. They also have, we'll talk about in the next chapter, in their next video, they also had a dance instructor come in as well. So Ruskin really was well known for his writings on art and his artistic skill, and Lewis Carroll is paying homage to him here before a lot of the other stuff that I talked about kind of went down. So, so at any rate, I hope that that gives you guys a really good understanding of the time and culture. I hate to end on that note, but that's where we end sort of in this chapter. The mock turtle and the griffin are telling this story, and then of course the Queen of Hearts imposes herself again and grabs Alice, and they whisks Alice away. So that is what brings us oh no, sorry guys. So that actually happens. Sorry, that happens later at the end of chapter, the next chapter, when the queen comes back into center stage. So what happens at the end of this chapter is that they are crying about their past experiences, and then we go into the lobster quadrille, which another civilized activity, and we will talk about that next time. Sorry for the confusion, but I do hope you learned something in this video. Thanks.